Hello everybody, welcome to the video. Today we're going to be talking about Sony's newly released A7 IV. This entire video is not based upon me looking at the specs or looking at other people's reviews. I have had my hands on the camera for 5 days now. So on that note, I'd like to thank Gordon Lang at Camera Labs for letting me test this out. And if you want to see a full technical review, really delving into all the specs of this camera, check out Gordon's video. I'll put a link up in the top and at the end of this video. If you're not familiar with my channel, my name is Ben Harvey. I'm an architect, I make YouTube videos, and I'm also a photographer. And occasionally, like in today's video, I review camera gear. So on that note, let's get into it. That reminds me, there's a caveat that comes with this. This is a pre-production model, so any glitches or anything not quite right in this review may be updated in future firmware. Caveats done. Specifically, I'm not going to make another video reviewing this camera and its specs. I am particularly interested as a Sony A7 III user, should I be upgrading from the Mark III to the Mark IV? Hopefully this video will answer that question. Right, let's talk about the differences, the improvements. Now when you first pick up the Mark IV, you'll immediately notice the difference in the size of the camera body. It's not taller, but it is thicker. And also the grip is now extended out a bit further. And just the change in the shape of the grip actually leaves your little finger with a home now. The thing that I struggled with the most on the Sony A7 III was that I feel like Sony were just trying to prove a point how much technology they could get in a really small camera. But what that led to was bad ergonomics. You couldn't really hold it properly. So in the end, I bought a small rig L bracket, and that meant that I could just hold it comfortably for longer periods of time. With the Mark IV, they've kind of resolved that. The camera's just a little bit deeper, the grip is bigger. Overall, this feels a lot more comfortable in the hand. I've been a happy owner of the Sony A7 III for over 3 years now, and I would go on record and say this is the perfect camera with one exception, and that is the flip out screen, or the lack of flip out screen. So I'm happy to announce that the Mark IV is now sporting a fully articulating screen. This is it. This is all I really wanted. If you put this on the Mark III, we wouldn't be talking about any more upgrades. Seriously. I'm not sure where the camera market goes now that the A7 IV is out, because this literally ticks all the boxes. It's also very relevant because I have broken the screen on my A7 III. I made a video about that up here, and that was annoying. So you can flip this around and close it so that the screen is not facing outwards anymore. So when that goes in my camera bag, I'm using that to protect the screen itself. Now it's not the highest resolution screen, it's not the best screen available, but it certainly does the job for me, so no complaints there. Very welcome addition. Moving on to the side of the camera, the strap attachments on the Mark III have a horrible rattle to them, and there's the potential for it to ruin your audio. That's what my A7 III sounds like when I rattle it. Luckily, they've addressed that in the Mark IV, A7 IV. No noise. They're kind of rigid. You move them and they stay in place. Thank you, Sony. On the A7 III, one of the most disappointing features of this is the side flaps to get to your ports. It's literally got the flimsiest, worst designed plastic flaps that it's just not up to the standard of a £2,000 camera when it came out. So once again, the Mark IV is a massive improvement on that. All of the port covers now have got a reassuring hinge to them, a lot more solid plastic, they all clip into place, and the good thing is the audio jack is at the top, so if you flip out the screen like so, when you've got your microphone plugged into the top, it does not obscure the screen, so this has been really well thought out. And at the front you've got a full-size HDMI port, which is another upgrade from the Mark III. On top of the Mark IV, things have changed around a little bit. There's now a dedicated movie record button. The exposure compensation button now doesn't have any markings on it because it can be a multi-function button, and it's also got a locking mechanism. So you push that, it only requires one finger to do that. Push that down and it stays locked. Push it again and it unlocks. And you can just go into the menus and program that for whatever you wish, not just exposure compensation like on the Mark III. Underneath the main mode dial, you've now got a, let's call it a base switch, and it's got a button on the front of it. You push that in with your finger and you can now toggle between stills mode, movie mode and S&Q mode. Now out of everything on the camera, this is the one thing that I can't speak positively about. I think it feels a bit flimsy and it's a bit thin, so when you push it with your finger, it does actually leave an indent in your finger. It functions, but out of everything on the camera, ergonomically, that's the one thing I don't like about this camera. Other than that, you'll be very familiar with all the buttons if you're coming from an A7 III. For you photographers out there, you will know, or you may have heard, that there is an increase in resolution. So the A7 III has 24 megapixels and the A7 IV has 33 megapixels. So on paper, more resolution. But what is that like in real life? I'm going to hand you over to the younger me on a windy beach, taking some landscape photographs, and we'll see what this means in reality.
It was so windy, in fact, that most of the audio was completely unusable. So let me talk you through exactly what I'm doing. This is a beautiful scene, sunset down on shore and beach, and the principle is I'm going to be taking the same photograph on the Sony A7 III and the Sony A7 IV. Same settings, on a tripod, 2-second timer, and for this I'm using the Sony 20mm f1.8 because that is the sharpest Sony lens that I own. First up, I take the shot with the Sony A7 III, manual focus, I review the image, zooming right in just to make sure there's no camera shake. I'm happy with that. Exactly the same process again, A7 IV, I didn't even move the tripod, manual focus, review the image, happy with that. Here are the two images side by side. On the left, you've got the Mark III, and on the right is the Mark IV. Lightroom doesn't even recognise it as the Mark IV. But let's scroll through some of the EXIF data. If I scroll through here, you'll see that these are exactly the same settings, with the exception of the Mark IV is at ISO 250 because the sun was setting and these images were taking a few minutes apart so that I could set up the camera properly. Otherwise, they're identical. Let's zoom in a little bit. At 100% you can see that the image from the Mark IV is slightly larger on the screen, but it's quite difficult to tell them apart really. So let's zoom in a little bit further. Here is 300% so that we can have a look at the writing on the sign. Both of them are very pixelated at 300%, but I think that the Mark IV has got the slight edge here, although you still can't read it, it's not night and day. Looking at the centre of the image where the railings are, the A7 IV seems to have a bit more detail in it, it's got the slight advantage. Let me know in the comments if you're seeing a massive difference between these two images and which one you prefer.
I was always very impressed with the focusing capabilities of the Mark III, but that has been improved upon with the Mark IV, with general speed and performance has definitely had a boost. Secondly, you also get now animal and bird autofocus, and you've obviously got the existing human eye and face detection. Let's head back down to the beach again. This time we're going to be comparing autofocus capabilities for video. Right, Sony A7 III focus test.
For both of these tests, I set the lens to autofocus. Obviously, the camera is set to continuous autofocus. The focus range is set to wide, and I've got face and eye detection on. And the A7 III is doing a very good job here, but there is a hesitation between maybe half a second to a second when it focuses from foreground to background.
Sony A7 IV focus test for video.
You can see here that the Sony A7 IV is significantly faster. I would say immediate, but it's not jarring, it doesn't snap, but it is very, very quick. There's no doubt about it, there's definitely an improvement from the A7 III to the A7 IV. You can trust this autofocus.
Burst rate for stills is not actually very straightforward, and I typically don't shoot JPEG, so I was interested in the capabilities of raw image shooting here. So the A7 III only has compressed and uncompressed RAWs, and the A7 III has now 3 settings. But without delving too deep into that, both of these perform at the same speed when shooting JPEGs or compressed RAWs. But if you switch the A7 IV to uncompressed RAW, the burst rate takes a massive hit. So Gordon's done a lot more testing than I have. I'll put a link up to his video here again. I did a quick test. I put the same memory card in both of these cameras, same settings. I put them to compressed RAW and uncompressed RAW, and here are the results. So this is the spec of the memory card I'm going to be trying out. This is the fastest memory card that I can get.
First up, the Sony A7 III, uncompressed RAWs only. That's what this sounds like. Sony A7 III again, but now compressed RAWs only. The new A7 IV, uncompressed RAWs only. And finally, the new A7 IV, compressed RAWs only.
So there you go. Based upon my tests, if you want to get fast burst rates using RAW out of the A7 IV, even with the fastest memory cards around, you still need to be doing compressed RAWs. Let's talk about video. If you shoot 4K, then there's not really much of an upgrade between the Mark III and the Mark IV. Obviously, you've got a flip out screen, but in terms of specs, if you shoot 25p in 4K, yes, you're getting slightly crisper image because it's now downsampled from a 7K footage down to 4K, so you do get that. However, in terms of specs, as in slow motion, if you want 4K 50 frames per second, there's a 1.5 times crop. That might work for you, but if you were still looking for a full frame 4K slow motion footage, then this isn't the camera for you. You're going to have to get the A7 III. And that's probably why they did this, because if they put slow motion 4K in this camera, everybody would just sell their A7 III. But for somebody like me who shoots everything in HD, I'm still getting the same 100 frames per second, but that's not actually an upgrade from the Mark III. As a summary, it's not a massive leap in terms of video specs from the Mark III to the Mark IV. But before I completely dismiss all of the upgrades for the video, this does have the option of 10-bit in camera now. You're not going to have to record that externally. And you've also got Cinetone, which is a color profile, which I haven't had the opportunity to play with it, but everybody's raving about it. So that is now all happening in camera. There was one feature on the A7 III that was slightly lacking, and let's see if it's been improved upon the A7 IV, and that is stabilisation. Let's head back down to the beach. Right, so let's do a vlogging test. Apologies if it's a bit windy. You might be able to see that the wind turbines are going. Okay, so what we've got here is the Sony A7 IV with the 20mm f1.8 at 1.8, and I've got steady shot on, and the digital stabilisation is also set to active. Okay, same test again, but this time with the Sony A7 III, my Sony A7 III, and this has got IBIS, but it's just enabled. Same lens again, so we've got the Sony 20mm f1.8, same settings.
Now if you put the two side by side, the A7 III on the left, the A7 IV on the right hand side, you can see that that digital active stabilisation is creating a crop, but what you get back is much smoother footage. And take into consideration that this lens is not stabilised, and walking and talking shots on a full frame camera is quite demanding.
If you shoot a lot of video, then you're probably familiar with the term focus breathing. Essentially, this is a lens that appears to be zooming in and out as it focuses on an object close to the camera and then in the distance. Now Sony have fixed this problem in camera live as it's happening. So this is called focus breathing compensation. If you enable that, essentially the camera crops in a little bit, and then that just accommodates the slight shift in perspective that you would get as the camera focuses on objects close and then in the distance. So that's a nice touch. Nobody was expecting that. Okay, let's wrap up this video. Should you upgrade from the A7 III to the A7 IV? In my opinion, there are two features that would make me want to upgrade. First of all, pretty obvious, the flip out screen. This is a big deal. If anybody asked me before this came out, what do you want the Sony A7 IV to have? Top of the list, flip out screen. No questions. It had to have this. So that is in the bag. The second feature that I would consider upgrading to the A7 IV is because of the stabilisation. If you compare the A7 III stabilisation side by side to the A7 IV, this is a leap forward. As well as those two main features, all of the other incremental changes are very much appreciated. The boost in resolution, the better focusing system, the new menus, all of those features add up to very well-rounded cameras for both photography and for video. But let's just put things into perspective. Let's just say I get £1,000 back from my A7 III. I'm going to be losing out on perhaps £1,500 to get the A7 IV. Now, I would sell this because there's no point in keeping this. If photography is your main business, I think that could be 100% justified. If it's a hobby for myself, I think it's a bit harder because how much am I willing to pay for a flip out screen and better stabilisation? That's the question. But they're just my preferences. You may be very much in need of more resolution, better focusing system, lots of other features that they've packed into this. Let's just say you don't own an A7 III. I don't know why you're watching this video, but If you don't own that, don't get the A7 III, get the A7 IV. This is going to be a solid investment. This is going to last you for years. You'll be very happy with your purchase. Hopefully this video has helped you make an informed decision whether you should be buying the A7 IV or upgrading from the Mark III to the Mark IV. If you've got any questions, make sure you chuck them in the comments below. And if you like this content, consider subscribing to my channel. Don't forget to watch Gordon's videos as well, because he knows a lot more than I do. Otherwise, thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Sony fanboy here. Had that covered up the whole time. Could you tell? Although I'm filming this on a Canon. Don't hate me. Quick tip, if you ever want to get loads of weird attention, just do a focusing test on a public beach. That's probably raised enough suspicion for now.